is always a place of conflict. Secondly, the desert is a place of communion. It's the place of communion. Notice in chapter 5, verse 16 of Luke, Jesus is very popular. The news about him is spreading. And instead of taking this as an opportunity to say, I've got it made because I'm beginning to catch on in my popularity, he was climbing the ladder of success in the eyes of men. The response is this, 5:15. But the news about him was spreading even farther, and great multitudes were gathering to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But he himself would often slip away to the wilderness and pray. Some translations say the desert, but it was a frequent occurrence. Now turn to chapter 6, verse 12 of Luke. Notice that Christ is going to choose the 12 disciples, and it says, and it was at this time that he went off to the mountain to pray, and he spent the whole night in prayer to God. What was going on? How do you spend 6 hours in prayer, 12 hours of prayer? We sing Sweet Hour of Prayer. Many people who sing Sweet Hour of Prayer have never spent one uninterrupted hour in prayer. What was Jesus doing? You see, Jesus was finding in God the Father a listening ear. He was finding the Father to meet his spiritual inner needs. He was finding the Father's will as he sought it, as he would lay bare before the Father all of the concerns that he was facing in the tremendous, pressurous ministry of healing, which was so exhausting. He was doing that. There was communication from the Son of God to God the Father, but there was also communication the other way as well. God the Father was there in heaven with Christ in the desert. And God the Father was bestowing upon Christ all of the inner resources that Jesus needed for the pressures of ministry, for combating Satan. It was two-way communication. That's why we call it communion. It was Christ in the presence of the Father whom he loved, and it was the Father with Christ of whom he said, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am delighted." My dear friend, there was a lot of things that was happening there. Lots of things were happening in the desert. Jesus Christ receiving from God the Father and giving back to God the Father. Now, if you want to learn the lessons of the desert, you must have those two kinds of communication going on. Most of the time we think that prayer is simply coming to God and unburdening ourselves and saying, "God, this is what I'm concerned about." And that's only half the story. The other half is God speaking to you in language that you can understand, so that you leave that area of the desert and you say, "I have heard from the Almighty." You say, "Well, are you talking about some mystical inner voice?" No, God may sometimes speak that way, but I am talking about the voice of God through the Scriptures. Later on, I'll be sharing with you how George Mueller discovered something that transformed his life. He discovered that before he could even begin to pray, he had to first of all hear God's voice and refresh himself in the promises of God before he could pray with confidence. And you see, those who have found rest and comfort and resources in the desert, they knew what it was like to be met by the Almighty. That's why Bernard of Clairvaux could say, "Jesus, thou joy of loving hearts, thou fount of life, thou light of men. From the best bliss that earth imparts, we turn unfilled to thee again." Communion in the desert.
Well, my friend, as I conclude today, I want to pick up a phrase that I used in the message just a moment ago, and that is hearing the voice of God in the desert. Recently, I've been meditating on John chapter 10, where Jesus says regarding his sheep, he says, "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them." What does it mean to hear the voice of Jesus? Well, as I mentioned, This does not mean that we hear a physical voice, even as you're listening to my voice at this moment, but there is that sense of acceptance and clarity in our relationship with God. All sin has been taken away. The Word of God has been poured into our hearts. We receive also wisdom in community among other believers, wisdom in the church, and we have that sense that we are walking with the Almighty and that we are indeed engaged in knowing and loving God. And yes, as I mentioned, George Mueller's experience really is an experience that all of us, I'm sure, have had or should have had, namely the realization that we really cannot find happiness and contentment unless we begin each day at the foot of the cross, filling our souls with the Word and with our Father who is in heaven.
Thank you, Dr. Lutzer. A place of conflict, communion, and commitment. That's the desert we're called to enter as we follow Christ. Erwin Lutzer is continuing his series on What Would Jesus Do? With part 1 of Following Christ into the Desert. Running to Win comes to you from Chicago's Moody Church to help you understand God's roadmap for your race of life. The complete 4-part series on What Would Jesus Do can be yours on CD, cassette, or MP3. For full information, call us toll-free at 1-800-215-5001. That's 1-800-215-5001. Visit our website. You'll find us at runningtowin.org. And don't forget, Running to Win is supported by listeners like you. This is Dave McAllister. For more about the desert we're called to enter as we follow Christ, join us for tomorrow's edition of Running to Win.